Congressman, thank you very much for being with us. Allow me to start with the resolution for commemorating the 30th year anniversary of the Operation Provide Comfort. Why this resolution at this time?
Well, number one, the Kurds are a fantastic culture, people, and steadfast ally of the United States. Uh, uh, this operation, I think, allowed the Kurdish people the freedom and the oxygen, so to speak, and the space from the murderous Saddam Hussein regime to really kind of get back on their feet and to establish themselves politically, economically, from a civil society standpoint. As we look back on it, and we saw Saddam's army taking action against its own people yet again in the aftermath of the Gulf War in 1991, against both the Kurds in the north and the Shia in the south. We could not, as the leaders of the free world, allow another Anfal massacre along the lines of what happened in 1998. And I want to commemorate and remind everyone that the United States military, the United States government stepped in to prevent another massacre through this operation. And I think the Kurdish people, the region, and our relationship was far better for it.
Right. And so in Congress, how much support is there for the resolution?
Well, I think it's widely supported, and it'll be supported by both Republicans and Democrats. There's a wide appreciation for the suffering of the Kurdish people under the Saddam regime, although that is always, I think, worth reminding now as we move on several decades later. But there's also an appreciation for the Kurdish people, their culture, how we have many of our values that are aligned in wanting a better life for our children, in line with those values of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and to have a free and fair and open economy. All of those things we share with the United States and with the Kurdish people. And I think that is always worth commemorating.
And so the bill, it's for commemorating the Operation Provide Comfort. Does it translate into anything else?
Well, I think keeping that relationship on the forefront of people's minds is important. And where that gets translated is continued support for the Peshmerga, continued importance of the U.S. overall relationship with Iraq and with Baghdad and the Iraqi government, how stability in that region or instability can spill over and very quickly affect the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. We saw that with the withdrawal of the Obama administration when they pulled all of our troops out, in my opinion, too soon. And we saw the rise of ISIS, their reign of terror across both Iraq and Syria, the establishment of a caliphate that then led to attacks to Western Europe and inspired attacks in the United States, including in the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, which is very near to my congressional district. So constantly reminding members of Congress that instability with our allies, not supporting our allies, can very quickly translate to violence and attacks around the world is very important.
Right, and right now there are also talks about the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. Is that something like concerns you, as you were referring to earlier, when the troops were reduced? Then we saw the rise of ISIS. We've seen recently attacks from other groups in Iraqi Kurdistan and Iraq in general. How concerning is that?
Yeah, it does concern me because we have to constantly explain to our political leadership, but to the American people, that we are fighting an ideology. that we are fighting a very extreme and violent interpretation of what is otherwise a beautiful and historic religion in Islam. And ISIS's interpretation, Al Qaeda's interpretation, isn't shared by most Muslims around the world, but yet they have twisted many minds in line with their ideology. And we have to remind the American people that ideology, that those terrorist attacks will follow us home. They will attack us here in the United States if we allow it, but that this is going to be a long effort, just as it took many decades to beat back the ideology of communism, fascism before that. We have to work together with our like-minded allies to continue to keep pressure upon the leadership, which I think amount in many cases to little more than thugs that are much more concerned with power than they are with any type of religious purity. And we have to stand by our allies around the world.
Let me ask one more quick question on that, since we're talking about it. But the U.S. troops in Iraq now, do you think it's not a good time for U.S. to withdraw troops, especially now that there are multiple actors in Iraq? They come and go as they wish.
Yeah.
Remaining U.S. troops there, is that something that's really necessary for right now?
Well, I believe that a small footprint, primarily focused on advising, assisting, training both the Iraqi counterterrorism forces and the Peshmerga is important because eventually we do need our allies to be able to fully stand on our own. We provide a lot of very valuable support, and I fully appreciate and know that it's the Peshmerga and the Iraqi army that's doing the real fighting. But the support that we provide in intelligence and logistics and air support is critical. It's also critical to have oversight of the billions of American taxpayer dollars that are going in to assist. So for that reason, a small presence, I do think, is important. We get a lot of benefit for our allies and for American security by having that small amount of soldiers in Iraq and standing with the Kurds.
One of the recent increase of attacks from ISIS in particular are in the areas, the disputed areas, where there's a security gap, a vacuum, if you will, between
Sure.
the Peshmerga and the Iraqi forces. And the Kurdish leadership have been asking for establishing a joint force in those areas so they can close those gaps. Is there, in your view, first of all, is there some sort of support within Congress and people in Congress? Because that's what the Kurdish leadership is asking for. And to be honest, without U.S. support, something like that would probably not be very feasible.
So I think that's important, and I certainly would support the concept, and that's another reason that having the American forces there. Again, I think there's a misperception back in the United States that there's hundreds and thousands of soldiers there. There's a very small number, but they serve a very important role along the lines of encouraging and helping advise the joint force that you're talking about, which I do think is important. And it's also important to understand and have an eye on the Iranian-backed militias that often are a force for instability rather than stability, and eventually incorporating those military forces into the overall Iraqi army. That is also an important role. And we need to encourage a move towards stability, peace, economic prosperity, and a political system that represents all Iraqis.
So the current administration doesn't really look like that they, frankly, know how to deal with the Shiite militias attacks. We've seen more and more militia attacks, and especially after the U.S. troops kind of relocated to Iraqi Kurdistan, then we saw these attacks also going to Iraqi Kurdistan. Does the current administration know how to deal with them? Because the small-scale, limited response to these attacks don't really deter these attacks, and yet the current
That's right.
administration looks like they don't want to respond as the previous administration because they don't want to get Iran angry.
Yeah, well, I think that's an accurate assessment. And if you look at the leadership of the Biden administration, it's many of the same people that were leading in the Obama administration when we had this same issue. And I think they fundamentally misunderstand the Iranian regime's approach. Iran will trade uh, um, casualties from its proxy forces, its militias, for American casualties happily all day long. It's only when you hold Iran itself accountable and impose costs, like we did with the targeted killing of Soleimani, that we reestablish deterrence and Iran backs down from these attacks. We saw in the run-up to the killing of Soleimani, attack on international shipping, an attack on international oil with Saudi Aramco, shooting down of our aircraft, and the killing of Americans, the attacks on bases and attacks on our embassy. But after the strike on Soleimani, that stopped because we imposed consequences directly on the Iranian regime, not on the Iraqi militias. And that is something I will continue to press the Biden administration to do.
Going back to the bills, you also co-authored or reintroduced a bill asking to provide visas for the Kurds in Syria who assisted Americans in the fight against ISIS. That bill was initially introduced, I believe, in 2019. What happened? Why did it not gain any traction if it didn't at that time?
Well, it did gain a good bit of traction. You know, there's a lot of things that go into this legislation, and sometimes it takes multiple tries and multiple years to fully get it into place. And this bill would be modeled on the special immigrant visa that we have had in place for some time with our translators and those who worked with us in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and to extend that eligibility to Kurdish Syria. Because as you well know, when in many of these very unstable places, particularly in Syria that doesn't enjoy the same level of stability in Iraqi Kurdistan, they put not just their lives on the line to stand with us against extremism, their entire families' lives are on the line to stand with us against extremism. And I think they need to be reassured that when they do that, that they will have a pathway to safety after a term of service alongside Americans. It's typically between 1 to 2 years. I think that's a very important message to send around the world, that we will stand with our local allies who stand with us at great risk and great danger. And I will continue to push to follow through on that legislation.
So if I understand SIV correctly, the principal applicant can also apply for their families. Is that something that in the legislation you guys are looking into also, not only for those?
Yeah, it's not only for the translator who was, you know, embedded with U.S. forces and sharing the same dangers, but we recognize that should ISIS or other extremist groups find out, and many times they do, it puts their families at great risk. And so the program defines family, you know, differently. It's typically just the very immediate family, but we'll flesh those details out in the legislation.
And there was significant media coverage, especially from some of the neighboring countries of Syria, and they were depicted, the legislation was depicted as an attempt to extend SIV to YPJ and YPG, or SDF in general, fighters or soldiers. Does that is that something that the legislation looks into?
Yeah, so we're still looking on how to best define that. Obviously, we cannot extend that type of legislation to any group designated as a terrorist organization. But so we'll keep a very narrow designation. But as it sits now, it's to the SDF.
Right, and the same question on the previous bill. I want to ask on this one. What's
Sure.
the? I know there's a Democratic congressman that works with you on this legislation, but
Yes.
how about the other congressmen? Are there some support for it?
Yes, there is some support, and having the Democratic support for it is very important. It's extremely important because they're in the majority right now in our Congress. But importantly, I could see it being attached as an element to our overall defense bill. And that legislation is almost always signed into law every year. So that's incredibly important that we have an actual legislative vehicle that we could attach this on as an amendment.
I know you have to go, but let me ask one last question. One
Sure.
of the concerns with some sort of SIV program, then you might have some of those who are helping the U.S. continue fighting against ISIS, because we know ISIS still is in Syria, is in Iraq. That might get some of those who are helping there and come here. Is that a real concern?
Yes, and that's a balance that we always have to strike. That we have to weigh that out. The numbers right now are relatively small, and the vetting procedures that we tend to put in place try to prioritize those that are in the most danger. Many of them who have served, for example, with our special forces that have seen significant exposure in combats, or those where the applicant can prove that their family is in significant danger. We try, it's not always perfect, to prioritize those first.
Congressman Michael Waltz, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.